Please subscribe, like and share this content. It means a lot to us. Thank you in advance. Cornell Law School. U.C.C. Article 3. Negotiable Instruments. Part 1. General Provisions and Definitions. Paragraph 3113. Date of Instrument. Primary tabs. A. An instrument may be antedated or post-dated. The date stated determines the time of payment if the instrument is payable at a fixed period after date. Except as provided in Section 4401 C, an instrument payable on demand is not payable before the date of the instrument. B. If an instrument is undated, its date is the date of its issuer. In the case of an unissued instrument, the date it first comes into possession of a holder. Paragraph 3114. Contradictory terms of instrument. Primary tabs. If an instrument contains contradictory terms, typewritten terms prevail over printed terms, handwritten terms prevail over both, and words prevail over numbers. Paragraph 3115. Incomplete instrument. Primary tabs. A. Incomplete instrument means a signed writing, whether or not issued by the signer, the contents of which show at the time of signing that it is incomplete but that the signer intended it to be completed by the addition of words or numbers. B. Subject to subsection C. If an incomplete instrument is an instrument under Section 3104, it may be enforced according to its terms if it is not completed, or according to its terms as augmented by completion. If an incomplete instrument is not an instrument under Section 3104, but, after completion, the requirements of Section 3104 are met, the instrument may be enforced according to its terms as augmented by completion. C. If words or numbers are added to an incomplete instrument without authority of the signer, there is an alteration of the incomplete instrument under Section 3407. D. The burden of establishing that words or numbers were added to an incomplete instrument without authority of the signer is on the person asserting the lack of authority. Paragraph 3116. Joint and several liability, contribution. Primary tabs. A. Except as otherwise provided in the instrument, two or more persons who have the same liability on an instrument as makers, drawers, acceptors, endorsers who endorse as joint payees, or anomalous endorsers are jointly and severally liable in the capacity in which they sign. B. Except as provided in Section 3419E, or by agreement of the affected parties, a party having joint and several liability who pays the instrument is entitled to receive from any party having the same joint and several liability contribution in accordance with applicable law. Paragraph 3117. Other agreements affecting instrument. Primary tabs subject to applicable law regarding exclusion of proof of contemporaneous or previous agreements. The obligation of a party to an instrument to pay the instrument may be modified, supplemented, or nullified by a separate agreement of the obliger and a person entitled to enforce the instrument, if the instrument is issued or the obligation is incurred in reliance on the agreement or as part of the same transaction giving rise to the agreement. To the extent an obligation is modified, supplemented, or nullified by an agreement under this section, the agreement is a defense to the obligation. Paragraph 3118. Statute of Limitations. Primary tabs. A. Except as provided in subsection E, an action to enforce the obligation of a party to pay a note payable at a definite time must be commenced within 6 years after the due date or dates stated in the note, or, if a due date is accelerated, within 6 years after the accelerated due date. B. Except as provided in subsection D or E, if demand for payment is made to the maker of a note payable on demand, an action to enforce the obligation of a party to pay the note must be commenced within 6 years after the demand. If no demand for payment is made to the maker, an action to enforce the note is barred if neither principal nor interest on the note has been paid for a continuous period of 10 years. C. Except as provided in subsection D, an action to enforce the obligation of a party to an unaccepted draft to pay the draft must be commenced within 3 years after dishonor of the draft or 10 years after the date of the draft, whichever period expires first. D. An action to enforce the obligation of the acceptor of a certified check or the issuer of a teller's check, cashier's check, or traveler's check must be commenced within 3 years after demand for payment is made to the acceptor or issuer, as the case may be. E. An action to enforce the obligation of a party to a certificate of deposit to pay the instrument must be commenced within 6 years after demand for payment is made to the maker, but if the instrument states a due date and the maker is not required to pay before that date, the 6-year period begins when a demand for payment is in effect and the due date has passed. F. An action to enforce the obligation of a party to pay an accepted draft, other than a certified check, must be commenced, I. Within 6 years after the due date or dates stated in the draft or acceptance if the obligation of the acceptor is payable at a definite time, or 2. Within 6 years after the date of the acceptance if the obligation of the acceptor is payable on demand. G. Unless governed by other law regarding claims for indemnity or contribution, an action, I. For conversion of an instrument, for money had and received, or like action based on conversion, 2. For breach of warranty, or 3. To enforce an obligation, duty, or right arising under this article and not governed by this section, must be commenced within 3 years after the cause of action accrues. Paragraph 3119. Notice of right to defend action. Primary tabs in an action for breach of an obligation for which a third person is answerable over pursuant to this article or Article 4, the defendant may give the third person notice of the litigation in a record, and the person notified may then give similar notice to any other person who is answerable over. If the notice states I. That the person notified may come in and defend and 2. That failure to do so will bind the person notified in an action later brought by the person giving the notice as to any determination of fact common to the two litigations, the person notified is so bound unless after seasonable receipt of the notice the person notified does come in and defend.